get into this mess, but more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, Nana, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different. Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel. Hello, good evening. It's me, Jacob Rees-Mogg, on State of the Nation tonight. Junior doctors began their longest ever round of industrial inaction today, persisting with their ridiculous demands of a 35% pay increase. The government has agreed to 6%, but said there will be no new borrowing or spending funded. And it is time we cut the bloated and bureaucratic state which has got too big and too expensive. The government has been given the green light to take the Rwanda case to the Supreme Court. But will democracy prevail over the perennial plight of the judicial activists? Meanwhile, a new list of Labour policies has crept out into the open and revealed the opposition's intentions to undo the work of the Conservatives in stifling the epidemic of eco-activism that has been plaguing public life. Mao's march through the institutions seem to have arrived in the UK. It's hard to know where this self-flagellation ends, but one rather woke charity seems to have reached the logical conclusion of their madness: self-cancellation. How did the left get such a stranglehold on our institutions? And speaking of marching socialists, as the Chinese Communist Party continues its erosion of a free Hong Kong, we will be joined by a dissident who just had a £100,000 bounty put on his head for the crime of supporting democracy. State of the Nation starts now. We'll also be joined by a distinguished panel this evening, contributing editor to the Socialist Novara Media, Michael Walker, and the historian and senior fellow at the New Culture Forum, Rafe Hadel-Mancu. As ever, I want to hear from you. It's a crucial part of the programme. Email me, mailmog@gbnews.com. And now it's time for the news with Rory Smith.
Thank you very much, Jacob. The Prime Minister has set out pay increases for millions of public sector workers. Police and prison officers will receive an increase of 7%, while teachers will get 6.5%. Teachers' unions say the new pay recommendations will allow them to call off strike action. Rishi Sunak warns there will be no more negotiating. Chancellor Jeremy Hunt has ruled out increasing taxes or borrowing to fund the pay increases.
We want to pay them fairly, which is why we've taken the decision to accept the independent pay review body recommendations. But at the same time, the reason that many of them are angry, the reason that we've had strikes, is because they've seen their take-home pay eroded by inflation. And it's vital that we don't do anything in accepting these awards that fuels inflation and means we're having the same disputes this time next year.
Well, junior doctors will continue striking tomorrow as the 6% offer to the British Medical Association falls well below the 35% rise the union is calling for. It's part of a 5-day walkout in what's being described as the longest in the history of the NHS. The government has been given the go-ahead to take a legal battle over its Rwanda deportation policy to the Supreme Court. The Prime Minister had said he fundamentally disagreed with the Court of Appeal's ruling the deal was unlawful. Home Secretary Suella Braverman has been battling to get the policy off the ground after it was previously blocked by appeal judges. Mental health charity Mind says people like Hugh Edwards experiencing serious mental health problems should be given the space to receive treatment. Questions have been raised regarding the Sun newspaper's conduct, as well as the BBC's response to the allegations that Mr Edwards paid a young person for sexually explicit images. The corporation's Director General will be questioned in Parliament next week on how the story was handled. The Met Police has found no evidence of criminality. And the coronation robes worn by the King and the Queen will be featured as part of the summer display at Buckingham Palace. King Charles and Queen Camilla have viewed the exhibition ahead of the official opening tomorrow. The public will have the opportunity to see the robes up close in the Palace Ballroom, where secret rehearsals for the royal family were held ahead of the coronation. The special event will last until September. TV, online, DAB+ radio and on TuneIn. This is GB News. Now though, back to Jacob.
The government has opted for a reasonable and fair compromise on public sector pay rises. It was announced today amidst the beginning of the largest ever round of industrial inaction from NHS junior doctors, with the following uplifts: 7% for police officers, 6% for doctors, plus a £1,250 bonus, 5% for teachers, 5% for troops, plus a £1,000 bonus. And perhaps more importantly, the Prime Minister has promised these increases will not be made up from borrowing or tax hikes, but from savings from various departments. This is a victory for common sense. And with the teachers' unions calling off strikes, the British Medical Association and junior doctors look increasingly isolated. Owing to the pandemic, the UK's debt-to-GDP ratio has now rocketed to about 100%. And for the financial year from 2022 to 2023, we spent a total of £111 billion on interest and debt repayments. That works out to over £2 billion a week, 9% of total government expending. And that, as we have discussed recently, has been made worse because the cost of borrowing has gone shooting up. And fundamentally, it's unsustainable. The state has got too big, we spend too much of your money every year, and we're not getting the productivity that we need to make it work properly. So what we need to do is to get a well-paid civil service that is more productive. And increasing productivity is essential because in spite of new technology, in spite of revolutions in the information age, productivity in the public sector has actually fallen since 1997. And that makes up about 20% of employment and is part of the reason overall productivity in this country has been lagging behind our competitors. And that must be the essential element of this. It's why the government is so right to insist that these pay increases will be funded within departmental budgets, because pay must be linked to productivity, otherwise it risks being inflationary. And when it comes to the NHS, not only do we need more productivity after all the money that's gone in post-COVID, but we also need to use the private sector where possible, as in fact Tony Blair was in favour of. Civil service has also got too big. Under Boris Johnson, there was a programme to cut it back by 91,000, merely to the level it was in 2015-16. And we need to look at pensions, because pensions in the public sector are much higher than they are in the private sector, but people don't necessarily recognise them within the pay that they're getting year to year. It's something that comes so much later. But we also need to look at public expenditure in the round and get rid of wasteful projects. HS2 must be at the top of this list. Its chief resigned earlier today, and there's probably £100 billion of savings. We mustn't be led astray by the sunk cost fallacy. Unfortunately, the legacy of the pandemic is a new expectation that the state is there to do everything. That is wrong. It can't. If we continue down this path, we will do nothing but decline. We will be in the business of managing decline rather than unleashing the animal instincts of this nation and unleashing growth. But of course, I want to hear from you. Let me know what you think. mailmog@gbnews.com. I'm now delighted to be joined by a regular on this programme, Labour MP Lloyd Russell-Moyle. Lloyd, thank you for coming in.
No problem, Jacob.
Do you feel that the doctors are now isolated because almost everybody else has accepted the pay increases? The pay review board's recommendations have been accepted by the government, just leaving the junior doctors a bit out on a limb.
I think it's 6.5% also for teachers. You said 5%. My understanding is that...
Yeah, 6.5, yes.
That's what they're being offered. Look, the teachers might not accept it. That's still got to go to ballot and go to discussions with the actual members. But the senior union leadership have recommended it on provisos, and that's provisos that they need to be given more evidence on the savings that are going to be achieved. They can't be achieved by cutting frontline workers like support staff in schools, which is what has happened so far. We can't see our classrooms having only one teacher in them when you have a number of children that have disabilities, behavioural and emotional issues that will need extra support staff in, and that will not help anyone. So we need to hold our breath a little bit to see whether that happens. And the doctors will be worried about exactly the same thing. There's no good in keep saying we will have these savings through productivity, where we know actually there have already been huge cuts and productivity savings in some of those public services.
But NHS productivity, especially through the pandemic and post the pandemic, with very large increases...
But how do you measure productivity?
On outcomes of number of operations carried out and so on and so forth. There are consistent measures of productivity within the NHS which show a sharp decline.
Well, it does depend on the inputs which changed during the pandemic, as we all know. But there is a problem with the NHS, and a lot of that problem is either on the social care side and on the primary care side, so seeing your doctor and getting social care. The problem's actually not in the hospital. So if you make cuts in the hospital for productivity to make hospital doctors pay, you might find that actually you bung up that part of the system as well. There needs to be concerted effort to sort out GPs and to sort out social care. And this announcement today doesn't deal with either of those.
But today was an announcement on pay rather than on productivity. But would you agree that there is an opportunity to increase productivity in the NHS, that is something that should be a real focus of what NHS England is doing?
If we get our doctors' surgeries working again, which is partly about pay, but it's also partly about reform and moving away from the partner model that just doesn't work anymore, and we sort out social care, then yes, we can start to see productivity increases, but we can't do it by just trying to make savings and productivity increases, as you call them, savings, in hospitals where actually hospitals already are quite lean machines.
But I think this is really interesting because it seems to me that actually the Labour Party is very willing to talk about productivity increases in the NHS rather than simply suggesting more money, whereas historically the Labour Party has been much more interested in suggesting money.
Well, we think both are needed. But if you look at the social care part, for example, there is a bit around workforce and more resources that are needed into social care. Everyone agrees with that. But the current system where social care is handled separately to hospitals, hospitals can't discharge properly, that handover takes too long, that is about getting systems working.
I absolutely agree with that, and there's a terrible waste of money because being in hospital is much more expensive than being in social care, but social care comes out of the council budget rather than out of the hospital budget.
But the big problem we have with social care is, and this pay offer isn't for social care, so it doesn't cover those workers. They are very badly paid, usually at minimum wage, where they have high levels of skill that are needed in terms of interpersonal skill, maybe not at high levels of degree level, but high levels of interpersonal skill, of which are transferable, particularly in the hospitality sector. And the hospitality sector, the private sector, is paying huge amounts more than the social care sector. So unless we deal with pay, we will not be able to deal with productivity.
I both agree and disagree with that. I think that you're right that pay needs to be increased, but I think you can do that whilst raising productivity. I think if you look at some of the things they're doing in Japan, where indeed they're even using AI in Japan and remote monitoring in Japan, they're able to pay people more but maintain higher levels of productivity and actually look after old people better. So I think my model would be that you pay people more, but you have fewer of them because you're more productive.
That's, of course, a part of all the options that need to be looked at sector by sector. In some areas, you can't have less people. You know, it just doesn't work. We know that having less people and children being taught by computers produces children that can read and do maths quickly, but actually aren't very good at inventing things. And the big thing that we are good at in the global stage is developing ideas and inventing them. And so we need children to be able to have creativity as part of their core curriculum, and that takes human being input and time. And there is no way that AI yet has been able to replace that. And so we know in some areas productivity can't come from staff cuts.
Indeed, but that in the overall scheme of things, recognising that there simply isn't further money just to be taken, that government expenditure of GDP is over 45%, that is an historically high level. Therefore, you need to work within the existing fiscal boundary is surely the right decision for the government to have made. And a Labour government would have made the same decision, I would expect.
The Labour government, of course, would be looking at trying to balance the books very tightly, making sure that we don't have borrowing for day-to-day spending, all of the stuff that everyone kind of agrees with. What we would do, though, however, is look at how the pie for income is distributed. And at the moment, for example, when you earn over £50,000, your national insurance actually goes down rather than up. All we would propose is a flat rate of national insurance, same for everyone. Flat rate is usually a libertarian right-wing idea. That means that, for example, that change wouldn't affect anyone earning under 50,000, but would generate enough revenue, would get enough revenue to pay for all of our social care needs.
That would be a huge increase in taxation, and
but
people
not for ordinary people.
Pounds have been absolutely whacked by fiscal drag, and in London, people earning £50,000 aren't that well off.
Well, no, but what we need to do is look to see how the very poorest are even worse off. It's no good saying people in the middle have been squeezed. People at the bottom have been squeezed as well. And the average wage in this country is under £30,000.
Well, you heard it here first. Labour is the party once again of high taxation. Thank you very much, Lloyd. We were agreeing so much before that, but don't forget to let me know what you think. mailmog@gbnews.com. Coming up, the government has been given the green light to take the Rwanda ruling to the Supreme Court. Is it time to do away with judicial activism? Plus, we're going to be joined by a Hong Kong democracy activist in exile as the Chinese Communist government overstepped the mark by placing bounties on dissidents' heads.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, "Nah, stop arguing." I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I'm still Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation. You've been getting in touch with your thoughts. And we, the taxpayers, paid for the education of these junior doctors. I think they should repay the country in some part for their ability to eventually earn an important and extremely well-paid job. Annette, junior doctors demand a 35% increase in pay, citing a loss in income since 2008. That was the year of the banks crashing, and everyone has seen a drop in income since then. It is not something that happened only to junior doctors. They need to have lessons in the reality which affects us all. So now, to enter the Jarndyce versus Jarndyce territory, last month, the Court of Appeal overturned the High Court's decision to uphold the government's Rwanda deportation policy. The government then applied to the High Court to take, to the Court of Appeal, to take the Court of Appeal to the Supreme Court to challenge the judgment. And the Court of Appeal gave the government the green light to take it, the Court of Appeal, to the Supreme Court for an appeal today. I'm sure you're not confused and you followed very closely, but not to worry. The point is that ultimately democracy must prevail and judicial activism must fail. The Rwanda policy is an important step in creating a deterrent against the Channel crossings crisis that we have seen over the past couple of years. And it's the right of this democratically elected government to pursue its own policy agenda without political interference from the Court of Appeal or from the ECHR. Joining me on this is my panel of contributing editor to Novara Media, Michael Walker, and the historian and senior fellow at the New Culture Forum, Rafe Hadel-Manku. Thank you both very much for joining me. Michael, I mean, it is quite a complicating setup that you appeal to the Court of Appeal to appeal against its own judgment. But the government does have a democratic mandate to begin the Rwanda removals. Surely they should be allowed to get on with them.
Yes, I mean, so it goes from the High Court to the Court of Appeal and then to the Supreme Court. So presumably this will be the final decision, I would imagine. I suppose in terms of the democratic point, the government is, or the Parliament is sovereign, I suppose, but the courts are there to make sure that all of the laws we've signed up to are consistent. Now, Parliament has decided that we will be part of the European Convention on Human Rights. They could decide to leave it. That would put us in the same group only as Greece, who left it after they suspended democracy in the 1960s and there was a military junta, and Russia after it entered Ukraine. So it's not necessarily company we want to be keeping. But if MPs wanted to, they could leave it, and then obviously the court would say, fine, go ahead. because that's what they think the Rwanda policy is breaching. Now, potentially the Supreme Court will decide that actually Rwanda is a safe enough country. Obviously, the High Court made one decision. It was overturned by the Court of Appeal. So potentially there's differing views within the judiciary. So it could be overturned, but either way, it doesn't seem to me to really impinge on democracy in this country.
And Rafe, the Supreme Court does seem to have moved away from the highest point of judicial activism under Baroness Hale when she got herself involved in things which were clearly the responsibility of the executive.
Yes, but this really does play to the government's hands here, because they can then portray themselves as fighting for the rights of the people, being thwarted by the House of Lords and by the judiciary. I'm trying to get excited about this being allowed, but at the end of the day, I view this as a great distraction. You know, the Rwanda policy is simply designed just before an election comes around to convince the British public that the government is actually getting serious, finally. They've had 13 years to get serious. The Rwanda plan is akin to trying to empty a swimming pool with a teaspoon. There's a whole raft of policies that could easily have been enacted by this government. Denmark has done it successfully. You know, Germany has now got temporary visas for asylum seekers so that they know that they won't be staying in Denmark. They've more than reduced by 3 times the number of asylum seekers there, simply by reducing benefits by 50%, by confiscating assets over £1,000 a year. The only thing you have to do, really, is make Britain less attractive than France. And the government has had 13 years to do this. Crack down on the black markets.
England's always more attractive than France for all sorts of reasons. But in terms of your point that, yes, of course, the government could withdraw from the European Convention, but on the prisoner voting rights, it eventually had a negotiation with the Council of Europe so that both sides accepted some element of compromise, that we could do effectively what we wanted, but we accepted that the court had some authority. Do you think there's something along those lines that can be done so that this policy can be implemented in a way that leaves everybody happy?
I mean, I suppose that's possible. That'll be up to the government to have a negotiation with an international body. I suppose to push back slightly on where you're coming from there, I do think there is this misleading notion which is often put out, which is to say that the UK is a real soft touch on migrants and we're incredibly attractive and everyone wants to come here. Now, I think what that avoids is actually that there's almost double the number of asylum applications in France as there are here. So the issue for me is, if you want to get tough on illegal migration, you have to be willing to take your fair share of asylum seekers in the first place. And at the moment, actually, we take relatively very few asylum seekers compared to other European countries. So I do think there's potentially a bit of a misleading image which being put forward.
If those asylum seekers are legitimate.
We must move on, because Sir Flip-Flop strikes again. Last week, the Labour leader claimed the eco-mob Just Stop Oil should just stop. But now the Labour Party is back to being the political wing of Just Stop Oil, with a leaked document from its policy chief suggesting Labour would make eco-disruption easier. The Public Order Act, passed earlier this year, allows the police to search and seize items which could be used to aid in protest-related offences, and that should essentially be torn up, according to Labour. It claims the measures should be removed now, the measures that stop protesters attaching themselves to handrails, planes and trains, a measure which helps stop the disruption of your day. So I want to ask our friendly socialist, Michael Walker, what he thinks about this. Is this another flip-flop? Are you the political wing of Just Stop Oil?
Well, I'm glad you think I'm friendly. I'm not sure if Keir Starmer considers me really part of his wing anyway, so I'm not sure how relevant I am to answer that question. I suppose what I worry about here is I think there is a bit of an authoritarian tendency in the argument you put forward, which is to say, if you disagree with this particular law, you are therefore on the side of Just Stop Oil. And I don't think that's a particularly good way to make laws. So as far as I understand, this leaked document is about policies which will be debated, so it's not decided. And the one that stood out to me is the provision in the Public Order Act that you can have stop and search without suspicion. So basically blanket stop and search if there's a protest they're worried about. Now, to me, any kind of blanket policy which is quite invasive from the police without suspicion is quite a bad idea, right? So it seems a little bit disingenuous from my point to say, if you have a beef, if you have a disagreement with that small part of the law, then therefore you're in the pockets of Just Stop Oil.
There's a slight agreement here, and that is with regards to the degree to which police are allowed to have discretion here. And I think we have seen the police using too much discretion, such as, for example, during the coronation, when Republic, my great nemesis, Graham Smith, was arrested unfairly and simply before they even were allowed to start protesting.
And do either of you remember one of the first things that was done by Theresa May as Home Secretary in 2010 was to repeal the ability of the police to have a stop and search on the instruction of an inspector in a certain area with no reason at all because they just felt like it. I was actually stopped under that provision when driving my children back.
But if she had that position now, you'd say she's in the pockets of Just Stop Oil.
Absolutely fascinating. The thing that really interests me is that parties in opposition are always in favour of more liberty. As soon as they get into government, suddenly they begin to clamp down and think, well, actually, we must have this.
The Freedom of Information Act under New Labour, that was giving away power, wasn't it? Because you got the public and journalists could request documents.
But in the first few weeks and months of a government, they still think what they thought when they were in opposition. I remember...
And then you get 21-day detention.
And it going up to 90 days. Yeah. And it's just... Longevity in government makes governments more authoritarian.
Which is probably why we need a change.
I'm not going to get that.
But on this point, I think some of those calling for these changes in Labour weren't the ones standing up for the anti-lockdown protesters when they were protesting, and they were the ones calling for the police to be more heavy-handed and for them to come down and arrest and punish. So it doesn't always happen that those in opposition are less authoritarian.
I mean, there is a narrow line, isn't there? I'm all in favour of the legal right to protest. I draw the line when people glue themselves to things. I think that goes beyond what is reasonable. And also Just Stop Oil, when so few people cause so much disruption. If you've got 1,000 people protesting and that holds up the traffic, that's fair enough. I've watched some of these protests from my office in Parliament. You've got about 10 people. And that seems to me disproportionate that so few should be able to cause such inconvenience.
So, I mean, obviously, I personally agree with the demands of Just Stop Oil. I think the International Energy Agency says we shouldn't be going for new oil fields. We're going to see, well, we're currently seeing, actually, a heat wave in Europe, which is just phenomenal. You're seeing temperatures of 50 degrees in Spain. It's terrifying. People are going to die this summer from that. At the same time, I mean, obviously, if the public want to change the law somewhat so that protests have to change their nature somewhat, I don't think that's necessarily an outrage. What I do think is problematic is if someone like you, as you just did, say any kind of opposition to this particular law means that you, therefore, are in favour of stopping people going to work.
That's politics.
Well, so you could rephrase that as saying that's opportunism, that's cynicism.
No, it's not. It's that if somebody in a political position does something which supports an organisation that is disrupting people's lives, it's perfectly fair to say that...
Well, no, because what they are supporting is a much more general principle, which is to say the right to protest will be seriously damaged if you have such a sweeping law that gives all this discretion to the police.
I better give Rafe a final word on this.
Well, of course, we've had under the common law the issue of nuisance, and that's always been there. But I think this legislation is necessary. And I used to be an absolutist almost for protest, but for the reasons you're saying, I think this is necessary.
It's certainly a nuisance. Well, thank you to my panel. Coming up, the long socialist march through society persists. How did the left get such a stranglehold on our institutions? Plus, is it time to sanction the Chinese communists?
The temperature's rising. Boxed Solar, proud sponsors of weather on GBNews.
Good evening, my name's Rachel Ayres and welcome to your latest GB News weather forecast brought to you by the Met Office. So it's been a slightly less unsettled day through Thursday, but things are becoming more unsettled as we go towards Friday, with this area of low pressure pushing up towards the UK as we go through tonight and into Friday. So looking at the detail for this evening then, some clear spells for eastern areas at first, but cloud will start to push in from the west as we go into the start of Friday, as well as some pretty heavy rain, especially for southwestern areas. And with this, combined with some stronger winds, temperatures will be staying around the low teens for tonight. As we go through Friday, a pretty wet and windy day to come with a yellow wind warning in force for parts of southwest England and Wales. Heavy rain as well, pushing northeastwards throughout the day. Driest for longest across northeastern parts of Scotland. But with all that cloud and those strong winds around, temperatures will be feeling pretty low for the time of year, so highs of around 22 in the southeast. Now that rain will clear to the north of Scotland through the start of Saturday, but swiftly followed by some heavy showers and thunderstorms, as well as further strong winds, but this time for central, southern and eastern parts of England. And remaining unsettled as we go through the second half of the weekend and into the start of the new week, with temperatures at or below average.
The temperature's rising. Boxed Solar, proud sponsors of weather on GBNews.
The Live Desk with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Pip Thompson. It's here Monday to Friday on GB News.
From midday, we'll bring you the news as it breaks, whenever it's happening and wherever it's happening, from across the UK and around the world.
Refreshing, feisty, but with a bit of fun too.
If it matters to you, we'll have it covered on TV, radio and online.
Join the live desk on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Kerr, we tackle the issues of the day with real, robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates.
Do you not believe in prison?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned.
I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In a world of dull and predictable radio and TV shows.
Oh, hi. On Mark Dolan tonight, we've got big guests. We drill into the big stories of the day. The show adds up to a brilliant listening and viewing experience. Mark Dolan Tonight is the most entertaining current affairs show ever, and that's a fact. That's Mark Dolan Tonight, Friday, Saturday and Sunday from 9. Only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Like all families, we have arguments every now and then, but actually we agree on what the mission of GB News is, and that's the most fundamentally important thing.
GB News provides the kind of platform that lets all voices be heard. We don't hold back. We're free to say what we really think.
Just because some people who live in a tiny little Westminster bubble think that their particular story is important, that's not the most important story for me.
And often they will be difficult stories, stories that you won't find on the establishment media.
Because what people think in the north of England may be very different to what they're thinking in the home counties.
We're going to carry on telling the world what life is really like for households up and down the UK.
We love to be in your car, in your kitchen as you're having your breakfast. Whatever you're doing, you are part of the show. If it matters to you, it matters to us.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I remain Jacob Rees-Mogg, and you've been getting in touch with your thoughts. Chris says, seems to me, Jacob, that the biggest threat to democracy and what the people voted for is the unelected House of Lords, who are doing their best to stop any immigration policy. Well, we discussed that last night, and then I went home, and they carried on voting until midnight, voting against the illegal migration bill. We'll come back to House of Commons on Monday. Ray, your panellist says leaving the ECHR puts the UK on a par with Greece and Russia. Is America a member of the ECHR? Is Canada? Is Australia? Is Rwanda? Time this ECHR nonsense was put back in its misinformation box. Now, it seems our cultural institutions are dominated by the self-flagellating wokerati. But the question is, where does it take us? Well, a major charitable foundation might just have found the answer: self-cancelization. Langley Chase, an independent charity which provides millions in grants, I think it has £130 million in its assets, for all things social, racial and climate justice, has just announced its decision to abolish itself after concluding that philanthropy is a function of colonial capitalism. Perhaps The Guardian could enter this moral maze too and decide that its slave trade links leave it no choice but to shut up shop. But whilst on the face of it this is a rather amusing, silly story, it poses the bigger question about our unelected institutions and how the left has such a stranglehold on them. Very importantly, it was recently announced that the Office for Budget Responsibility latest appointment, Rita de la Feria, is a Brexit-hating, Corbyn-supporting lefty, and she should fit right in. Now, with me is my panel, contributing editor to Novara Media, Michael Walker, and fellow of the New Culture Forum, Rafe Hadelman-Koo. Rafe, you haven't been taken control of by the left-wing wokerati. How did you avoid this?
Well, look, I mean, the thing is, the left understand the importance of institutional capture far better than the right, and they're far more skilled at getting it. You know, Rudy Dushka, the Marxist activist, called this the long march through the institutions. And it really has taken place, you know. I don't think people are quite aware that we've had in Britain, actually, a quiet revolution has taken place. A revolution doesn't mean uprisings and red flags flying from the rooftops. The buildings that house our institutions may look the same, but the people who run those institutions and inhabit them are cuckoos in the nest, who bear no relationship to the people who built those institutions and who ran them until very recently. This all started in the 1990s, particularly under New Labour, and of course it's carried on, unfortunately, under the Conservatives. And I'm terribly sorry to say that again, but along with immigration, the woke takeover of our institutions has been the biggest single damage to our country over the last 20 years.
Michael, I'm not actually particularly fussed about Langley Chase, that as long as it's within the foundational documents of the charity, if a charity wants to wind itself up, that's fine. If its reason is absurd, that's a matter for it. But Rita de la Feria is quite serious, isn't it? Because the ABR has enormous unelected power. It can, as we saw last year, it can make or break a government. And therefore, having a Corbynista going on to a body that's already been in conflict with the government is quite a problem.
I'm not sure she's a Corbynista. I also don't shed many tears for right-wingers feeling sorry for themselves because it's so difficult to get into the institutions. Because, I mean, GB News is an example, right? Navarra Media, my organisation, we're paid for by our viewers, right? It's had to grow very, very slowly. GB News, someone has an idea, let's make a right-wing channel.
Decolonisation of our museums and our galleries, our universities.
Suddenly, you get venture capital that buys you a lovely studio.
The BBC, a left-wing organisation.
I don't think the BBC is a left-wing organisation. Anyway,
whenever they have a Conservative chairman, he gets forced out.
Let's bring these points. Let's bring these points together, and I think the BBC and the OBR are somewhat similar. Now, I think these institutions actually tend towards small c conservatism. Now, what I mean by that is not necessarily ideological conservatism, but they tend towards supporting the status quo. Now, you absolutely saw this with the BBC when it came to Jeremy Corbyn. Any kind of dispute in the Labour Party, if an MP was about to be deselected, they'd call it Stalinism. Now MPs are getting deselected left, right and centre, and there isn't a peep. When it comes to the OBR, lots of wonks were against Brexit. I know this person was against Brexit. That's because technocrats tended to agree that it wouldn't make Britain richer. The OBR, though, I think we might have an agreement, because I would get rid of it. I think it was introduced by George Osborne. The whole point of the OBR is to make government decision-making just about accounting, and what we have had since 2010, when George Osborne introduced it, is flatlining wages, flatlining productivity, and I actually don't think balancing budgets is the most important function of the Treasury. I think what they should be doing is investing in the future, taking more of a Joe Biden approach, right? American growth has been much higher than UK growth over the past decade, and one thing they have had is a more activist government.
And Donald Trump's tax cuts, actually, which were crucially important in his reform of corporation tax and his big reductions in it, had an amazing effect on the US economy, which the ABR would simply stop in this country.
Well, in both directions, right? So they would have stopped those tax cuts, but they also would have stopped Joe Biden's very, very ambitious subsidies and spending on the green economy. So, yeah, maybe we do agree on that.
Well, the idea that our institutions are small c conservative, I don't think you'll find a single viewer who would be agreeing with that. We're talking about culture here, and it's the culture of our institutions that
here we're talking about economics.
Fundamentally. But it's that same culture which is leading to people appointing people who have left-wing economic views. The entire culture has set into place now. For example, when I was at university, you would have two left-wing academics for every one conservative academics. Now it's closer to 11 to 1, and it's even worse in America. In primary and secondary schools now, we have fewer than 10% of teachers now vote for centre-right parties. You know, you just look at decolonisation through the British Museum. Our institutions have been taken over at every level, and it's a far more insidious thing than we think, because all institutions should have a balance to be healthy. Extreme right or extreme left is wrong, and when you're being told about the evils of being white in school, we're now being taught that the Church of England is teaching about the white supremacy pyramid. That is a left-wing takeover of our institutions.
Tony Blair was very clever, is that he reformed the institutions and then set up appointment processes that are much more likely to attract left-wing applicants than right-wing applicants. And that has led to people going into quangocracy as a career in a way that wasn't happening previously, because essentially the great and the good were asked to take over the chairmanship of the British Museum. They were tapped on the shoulder and that was it, which may or may not be a good way of doing things, but now the application process favours people who've had a career as quangocrats.
So I think there's two things going on here. Now, one, there are certain professions where people tend to be more liberal and more left-wing. I think that's partly because the working age population is actually more liberal and more left-wing. The Tory vote is reliant essentially on pensioners, right? And there's only so many pensioners you can insert into great cultural institutions because they're not currently of working age. I also think that when it comes to sort of the right's obsession with quangos and the like, now, as I've said, I don't think the IBR has performed very effectively, but I do think it comes partly as a distraction from the other spheres of cultural life where what gets you influence is money. So look at the Murdoch press, for example. Look at the newspapers. Now, all of them are right-leaning, nearly all of them are right-leaning, and that's because what gets you influence when it comes to newspapers is money. What do rich people want? They want low taxes. So there's a huge sphere of our cultural life where it's dominated by the right, and that's because money talks.
The Guardian, the Mirror and the Financial Times all lean leftwards.
Centre-left, right? So how did they all treat Jeremy Corbyn? How did they all treat an anti-establishment left-wing politics? And also, I mean, the circulation of the other papers dwarfs those three.
But far more important is education. You know, the old adage was, from Aristotle, give me a boy till the age of 7 and I will show you the man. It's now very much give me a boy till the age of 18 or 21 and I'll show you somebody who's gone now through every stage of education with a predominantly left-wing teaching agenda.
Well, thank you very much to my brilliant panel. Amazing level of agreement coming out this evening. Coming up, are we approaching a Cold War with China?
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by headliners on TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my new show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m, where real people get to meet those in power and hold them to account. Every week, we'll be hearing your views from up and down the country in the real world. Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it. So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There'll be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things. We've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I continue to identify as Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation. You've been getting in touch with your male Moggs. Jeff, Mao's march through the institutions has reached the UK via New Labour. And Philip, it's the Tories who control the institutions and have done for 13 years. The beginning of this month marked 26 years since the ceremonial handing over of Hong Kong to China after 156 years of British rule in the former colony. The 1984 Sino-British Joint Declaration clearly set out the protective principle of one country, two systems, which was meant to last for 50 years, ensuring that Hong Kong's system of governance would be maintained. For the first 20 years, all went reasonably well, and the Joint Declaration was broadly upheld. But then, the Chinese Communist Party began to disregard Hong Kong's traditions of freedom and liberty, and soon popular uprisings sprung up in fierce opposition. In 2019, as the Hong Kong government did the CCP's bidding in passing a controversial extradition law and then imposed a draconian national security law, the following year, fierce insurgencies erupted and nearly led to urban warfare between protesters and Hong Kong police. Fin Lau, my next guest, founded two pro-democracy groups in Hong Kong and was subsequently arrested. He came into exile in the United Kingdom to continue his activism, but it was only the other day when the Hong Kong government issued a bounty of $1 million Hong Kong dollars for his capture. That's about £100,000. Now, Mr. Fin Lau joins me this evening. Fin, thank you so much for coming in. So there's a bounty on your head of $1 million Hong Kong dollars. What is the effect of that? How does that affect your daily life?
Well, I've been quite cautious since I got the first so-called arrest warrant since 2020 under the same draconian national security law in Hong Kong. But then after getting the first explicit $1 million Hong Kong dollar bounty, I have been even more cautious. I keep looking around whether someone may follow me. After all, I got attacked in the UK 3 years ago.
But tell me about that. You were attacked and beaten almost to death 3 years ago in England.
Yes, it was during the first lockdown period. And I was having my daily walk near my house, just 3 minutes away. And then I just suspect that there were 3 guys trying to follow me. Once I stopped by a lamppost, they simply punched my right eye. So they keep punching and kicking my head. And I don't know how long I've passed out. I thought I lost my right eye immediately. And then I was so fortunate to wake up and then to stand again. And then the doctor and nurses, they spent around 5 to 6 hours to treat my injuries. I also got concussion and other kinds of injuries as well.
And this happened in broad daylight in England. Were you robbed? Was it a mugging? Was there any evidence that it was from the Chinese Communist Party?
Well, there's no direct evidence, but there are some kind of circumstantial evidence because they didn't say anything racist. They didn't take any of my personal belongings. And it happened 2 months before I got my first arrest warrant from Hong Kong authorities.
And in Hong Kong, you were promoting democracy, which was something allowed for under the Joint Declaration. And initially, there'd been a lot of confidence in the Joint Declaration, hadn't there? And China had behaved well and had maintained Hong Kong's freedoms. What went wrong?
Well, I would say that maybe for the first few years, it went well. But in the end, all kind of autonomy, civil liberties, rule of law, etc., was being eroded in Hong Kong bit by bit. And then everything accelerated since the rise of Xi Jinping in China, in Beijing.
Because Deng Xiaoping made a very interesting point when the Joint Declaration was signed for 50 years. He said he hoped that China would be able to catch up with Hong Kong, and now it seems that that's all been forgotten about. Yeah. And do you think it shows you something important about the direction of the Chinese government currently, that it's become more totalitarian than it had been under Deng, not just in Hong Kong, but in China itself?
Yes, so Hong Kongers, I would say, we are not the only victims. We also got Tibetans, we also got Uyghurs, and Taiwanese may be the next one. So they try to promote the idea of one country, two systems towards Taiwanese, but in the end, we know that it's a failure. So, well, that's why I would say that perhaps the 1984 Sino-British Joint Declaration is a diplomatic mistake.
And the Sino-Anglo Joint Declaration is meant to be an international agreement, but China now says it's none of your business, this is our domestic affairs, and tells the United Kingdom government just to shut up. And it's quite aggressive about that. Yes. What do you think the British government can and ought to do in response?
Well, in my memory, in 2015, it was the first time that the UK government declared a breach of the treaty by the PRC, by China. in the end, and then in 2019, 2020, then more and more declaration by the UK government. And then I think that there should be some kind of concrete action, for example, maybe targeted sanctions against Hong Kong senior officials. This is the least thing that we should do in terms of the violation of the treaty.
And what about businesses that are operating in Hong Kong, particularly HSBC, which seems to be not unsympathetic to the Chinese government? This is quite surprising for a UK business, isn't it?
Yeah, but I think the HSBC is leaning towards China more and more, especially after the promulgation of the Dracula NSL. And right now, I don't think that they're facing certain pressure or enough pressure from the UK side. So that's why all of those Hong Kong pension, most of them has been locked up in Hong Kong.
And so the UK government, in your view, should have targeted sanctions on individual members of the Chinese government. We should obviously try and work with the United States so that they would do it too, because that would have greater global impact. Yeah. What more can we do to help people like you, the citizens of Hong Kong, who are standing up for democracy?
Well, I would say there are at least two things. First of all, we are grateful for the introduction of the British National Overseas Visa Scheme. That helps thousands of people flee Hong Kong to continue to fight for freedom. And then on the other hand, I would say that perhaps we should think about maybe expanding the scheme, or perhaps try to accelerate the approval of different political asylum seekers from Hong Kong. So that's something that we may consider.
Well, it's such an important point because of all the colonies that the United Kingdom had, Hong Kong was the only one that we handed over to a totalitarian regime rather than allowing independence. And therefore, I've always thought we have a particular duty to the British nationals overseas in Hong Kong, who, up until 1981, were full British citizens, and it's just restoring that status to them.
Yeah, and going back to the 1980s, I would say that if there was a referendum before, well, maybe having the negotiation with Beijing, then perhaps the outcome would be different. At least the UK government may have a higher bargaining power towards Hong Kong future. But in the end, we didn't do that. As I would say that paved the way for the 1997 Hong Kong handover tragedy.
And in Hong Kong, there are still hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people supporting you, that we saw that when the people of Hong Kong took to the streets.
Yes, actually, back in 2019, we got more than 2 million people protesting on the street. But after the COVID, after the promulgation of the NSL, we couldn't see that anymore on the street of Hong Kong. But still, we got millions of Hong Kong try to fight.
Finn, thank you so much for joining me. I hugely admire your courage, and I hope that you will be kept safe in the United Kingdom. That's all from me. Up next, it's our Professor Mark Dolan, in for the other professor, Dan Wootton. Mark, what have you got in store for us this evening?
Jacob, brilliant show. Well, it's a busy 2 hours. Angela Levin on the Sussexes has the halo slipped for the royal couple in Hollywood, and the woke media elite lining up to defend Hugh Edwards, but the alleged victims have a voice too.
Oh, well, that all sounds very exciting, and I hope you'll talk about the courage of the Sun in standing up for freedom of speech. And that's coming up after the weather. It was sunny in Somerset today, but we still didn't win against Hampshire. It was a draw, which was disappointing. I'll be back at Monday at 8 o'clock. I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg. This has been State of the Nation.
That warm feeling inside. From Boxed Boilers. Proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
Good evening, my name's Rachel Ayres and welcome to your latest GB News weather forecast brought to you by the Met Office. So it's been a slightly less unsettled day through Thursday, but things are becoming more unsettled as we go towards Friday, with this area of low pressure pushing up towards the UK as we go through tonight and into Friday. So looking at the detail for this evening then, some clear spells for eastern areas at first, but cloud will start to push in from the west as we go into the start of Friday, as well as some pretty heavy rain, especially for southwestern areas. And with this, combined with some stronger winds, temperatures will be staying around the low teens for tonight. As we go through Friday, a pretty wet and windy day to come with a yellow wind warning in force for parts of southwest England and Wales. Heavy rain as well, pushing northeastwards throughout the day. Driest for longest across northeastern parts of Scotland. But with all that cloud and those strong winds around, temperatures will be feeling pretty low for the time of year, so highs of around 22 in the southeast. Now that rain will clear to the